My name is Captain Danica Merrill. I'm 29 years old. At Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, dust and mortality are the only two things that feel real. But the most lethal blow didn't come from the enemy. It came from a satellite call from my stepfather, Richard, back in Colorado. His voice was sickeningly cheerful. "Danny, great news. I just sold your father's cabin." I was speechless. "Don't be so shocked," he chuckled. "The money's going to clear some debts and get your stepsister Chloe that trip to Europe. It's for the greater good." Mine, obviously. Besides, that old shack was just gathering dust, just like your dad's medals. My blood ran cold. He thought 7,000 miles made me helpless. But he knew nothing about the stronghold protection file my lawyer and I had signed years ago. If you've ever had your sacrifices treated as worthless by your own family, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe, because this is the story of how a soldier used her battlefield skills to win justice right here at home. The satellite phone clicked off, but Richard's voice lingered in the dry Afghan air, a toxic echo in the silence of my small quarters. There was no screaming, no throwing things against the thin plywood walls. The rage that surged through me was too immense for such a small release. It was a cold, heavy thing, a block of ice forming in my gut. My training took over before my heart could shatter. I walked numbly to the makeshift latrine, the floor gritty with sand that got into everything. The face staring back at me from the polished metal mirror was pale under a layer of dust, the eyes wide but steady. They were a soldier's eyes, not the eyes of a wounded daughter. I wouldn't allow it. I cupped my hands under the weak stream of cold water and splashed it on my face. Once, twice. The shock of it was grounding, a physical anchor in a sea of emotional chaos. Then I began the drills. Tactical breathing, inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. The roaring in my ears began to subside, the violent tremor in my hands stilled. I watched my reflection as the soldier regained control. The rage wasn't gone. Oh no. It was being compressed, refined, channeled into something cold, sharp, and purposeful. Out here, mission focus is survival. You don't let emotion cloud your judgment. You can't. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that a new war had just been declared. And the front line wasn't in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. It was 7,000 miles away, in the heart of Colorado. But before launching a counteroffensive, I made one last attempt at diplomacy. I needed to believe there was still an ally on the home front, a friendly force I could count on. With a deep breath, I dialed my mother. The hope I held was fragile, and it died within seconds. "Mom," I said, my voice tight but even. "Richard just called me, about the cabin." A pause, a faint crackling sound on the line, then her voice, small and evasive. "I know," Carol whispered. The words were barely audible, laced with a guilt she couldn't quite hide. "You knew?" The question was quiet, but it carried the weight of my entire world. "Danny, listen," she started, her voice gaining a defensive edge. "Richard promised he'd handle everything smoothly. Don't make things difficult for him. He's under a lot of stress right now." The excuses washed over me, each one a fresh layer of betrayal. The debts, the pressure, the promise of a quick fix. I listened to her paint a picture of Richard as a victim, a man backed into a corner, forced to make a hard choice. "Difficult for him," I finally cut in, the ice in my voice sharp enough to cut glass. "He's selling Dad's house behind my back. He's selling our house, the one Dad left for me." "It's just complicated," she stammered. And then, her tone shifted from evasive to irritated, the way it always did when I refused to bend. "Why do you always have to be so rigid, so military about everything? Can't you just sacrifice a little for the family for once?" That was it. That was the killing blow. Not from the enemy combatant, my stepfather, but from the one person in the world who was supposed to be my unconditional ally. Sacrifice a little. As if my entire life wasn't built on sacrifice. The word hung in the air between us, an obscene insult. In her eyes, I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was just a resource, a tool to be used to maintain her fragile, artificial peace. The peace she had chosen over me, over Dad's memory, over everything that was supposed to matter. I didn't say goodbye. I just ended the call. The controlled calm I had fought so hard to build was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. My mind fled the dust and heat of Bagram and took refuge in the cool, pine-scented air of the Rockies. I saw the cabin. I could feel the rough texture of the fieldstone fireplace that Dad and I had built together one summer, my hands small and clumsy next to his. I could smell the faint, smoky scent of the old bearskin rug in front of it, the one he'd inherited from his own father. I pictured the bookshelf he built into the wall, filled with worn paperbacks on military history, biographies of Patton, chronicles of the Civil War, Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Richard wasn't just selling a building. He was liquidating my past. He was auctioning off the last tangible pieces of my father, the most sacred relics I had left. And the thought of him using that blood money to send his own daughter, Chloe, on a European vacation, it was a desecration. It was turning the legacy of a hero, a man who died for his country, into cheap entertainment, a down payment on backpacking hostels and train tickets. My grief solidified back into resolve. I strode out of the latrine and back to the Tactical Operations Center, the hum of servers and radios a familiar comfort. I sat down at my station, opened my encrypted laptop, and ignored the blinking notifications from my unit. This was a personal mission now, but I would execute it with professional precision. I didn't compose a long, emotional email. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing a short, coded message to my best friend, Laura Jensen, a contract lawyer in Denver, and the one person I trusted implicitly. The subject line was simple, urgent. The message was even simpler. Situation Redcon 1 at Stronghold, Ghost Pine. Hostile forces have seized the asset, requesting immediate deployment of legal countermeasures. Await further intel. Ghost Pine. The codename we'd given the cabin years ago, a joke between two friends that had just become deadly serious. I hit send. The war had officially begun. The coldness spreading through my veins wasn't new. It was a familiar ghost, pulling me back to another time, another holiday, when my dreams were sacrificed for someone else's comfort. Lying on my cot in Bagram, the harsh glare of a single fluorescent bulb overhead, I felt the ghost of that old, familiar coldness seep back into my bones. My mother's betrayal wasn't a fresh wound. It was the tearing open of a scar I'd carried for over a decade. A scar that was carved into me on what should have been one of the proudest days of my young life. The memory pulled me back across the years, back to the clatter of silverware and forced smiles of a Thanksgiving dinner when I was 18. The air in our Colorado Springs home was thick with the rich smells of roast turkey and sage stuffing. I was buzzing with excitement, practically vibrating in my seat. Just the week before, I'd received my acceptance letter to the United States Military Academy at West Point. It was more than a college acceptance. It was the culmination of every dream I'd had since I was a little girl wanting to be just like my father. It was my future, earned with straight A's, varsity letters, and grueling hours of preparation. I thought, naively, that everyone would share my joy. The whole extended family was there, aunts, uncles, cousins. At the head of the long dining table, Richard sat like a king on his throne. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler, Woodford Reserve bourbon, his favorite, purchased with my mother's money. He waited until everyone had a full plate before he cleared his throat, the sound silencing the low chatter around the table. He lifted his glass. A toast, he announced, a smug smile playing on his lips. To Danica. I felt a flush of pride. My mother shot me a quick, encouraging look. To Danica, he continued, his eyes scanning the room, who was about to waste the finest education in the world to learn how to salute and follow orders. But hey, he added with a wink, at least she'll look good in the uniform. A few obligatory, uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the room. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at my mother, pleading with my eyes for her to say something, to defend me. But she just looked down at her plate, suddenly fascinated by the task of carving a slice of turkey. She wouldn't meet my gaze. In that moment, her silence was louder than his mockery. It was an endorsement. The humiliation burned in my cheeks, hot and sharp. I spent the rest of the dinner pushing mashed potatoes around my plate, the festive meal turning to ash in my mouth. Later, as dessert was being served, pumpkin pie and pecan pie, my favorites, Richard began handing out presents. He had a flair for grand gestures, especially when they weren't on his dime. He presented my stepsister, Chloe, who was 16 at the time, with a small, iconic blue box tied with a white ribbon. "For my princess," he cooed as she opened it to reveal a delicate silver necklace from Tiffany & Co. She squealed with delight, and he beamed. Then he turned to me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope. He slid it across the table. "Here you go, Danny." I opened it. Inside was a single $50 bill. "Go buy yourself some thick socks," he said, taking a loud sip of his bourbon. "I hear the winters in New York are brutal." The message was crystal clear, delivered with the precision of a surgeon. Chloe, his princess, was an object to be adorned and cherished. I, the soldier, was merely functional, practical. My value was in my utility, like a pair of warm socks. The $50 felt like a dismissal, a final pat on the head to the family workhorse. I couldn't take it anymore. I excused myself from the table, the lump in my throat so tight I could barely breathe. I fled to my childhood bedroom and finally let the tears I'd been holding back fall, silent and hot on my face. A few minutes later, the door creaked open. It was my mother. For a wild, hopeful second, I thought she had come to comfort me, to tell me that Richard was a fool and that she was proud of me. Instead, she came with advice. She sat on the edge of my bed, not touching me, her hands folded primly in her lap. "You know how Richard is," she began, her voice a placating whisper. "He was just joking. You can't be so sensitive, Danny. The more you react, the more he'll push your buttons. You just have to learn to let it go. For the sake of keeping the peace. Keep the peace." The same hollow words she'd used on the phone just moments ago in my memory. Her advice that night taught me a devastating lesson. My feelings were an inconvenience. My pain was a disruption. My role was to absorb the cruelty, to be the silent shock absorber that kept the family machine running smoothly. It was a lesson I had, to my shame, followed for far too long. A lesson that, tonight, in the desolate sands of Afghanistan, I was finally unlearning for good. But the memory of that night wasn't entirely dark. There was one small flicker of light in the suffocating chaos. As I was trying to pull myself together, my uncle, my dad's brother, a quiet Vietnam vet who rarely spoke, tapped on my open door. He gestured for me to follow him out to the back porch. The cold November air felt good on my tear-stained face. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. He just reached into the pocket of his worn denim jacket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. He pressed it into my hand. "Meditations by Marcus Aurelius," he said, his voice raspy. "The greatest generals in history read it. It'll teach you how to make your mind a fortress. Don't let the little people breach the walls." He gave my shoulder a firm squeeze and went back inside, leaving me alone with the book and the cold, clear stars. That small book, filled with the wisdom of a Roman emperor, became my Bible. It went with me to West Point, and it was tucked inside my rucksack right now, here in Bagram. It taught me about honor, duty, and the internal citadel that no one could ever touch. It reminded me of my father's lessons about standing your ground, lessons that Richard's very existence seemed designed to mock. If you've ever been told you're too sensitive when you were justifiably hurt, please hit that like button. And in the comments, just type a simple, "I see you," for everyone else who has been there. It's time we stopped letting people invalidate our pain. Back in my cot in Bagram, the memory faded, leaving only a bitter residue. For 10 years, I had followed my mother's advice. I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. But as I looked at the encrypted message confirmation on my screen, a question burned through the fog of the past. Why did I keep hoping they would ever change? The answer to the question that had haunted me for a decade, why did I keep hoping they would change, was simple. I wouldn't. Hope was a passive strategy, and I was done being passive. Sitting there, in the muted chaos of the operations center, I shifted from grieving daughter to military intelligence officer. The target was identified. The objective was clear. It was time to mobilize my assets. There was only one person to call first. My best friend since kindergarten, my unofficial legal counsel, my rear guard. Laura Jensen. The satellite connection was surprisingly clear. When she answered, I didn't waste time on pleasantries or tears. We had a language of our own, forged over 30 years of friendship and sharpened by my years in the service. Laura, situation report, I began, my voice as flat and steady as if I were briefing a superior officer. There was a half-second pause on her end, and I could picture her instantly sitting up straighter in her high-rise office in Denver's Lodo district, her lawyer brain kicking into high gear. Go ahead, Captain, she replied, her tone matching mine. Professional. Focused. The adversary's name is Richard Stone, I stated. He has executed a hostile action in an attempt to seize a joint asset, Stronghold Ghost Pine. Initial intel suggests he has misled a real estate agent and potentially forged signatures to secure a sale. This wasn't just a way to cope, it was how we worked best. By stripping the pain away and treating it like a tactical problem, we could operate without emotion clouding our judgment. We could be efficient. We could be lethal. Understood, Laura said. I heard the distinct click-clack of her keyboard. Accessing the Steel Covenant now. The Steel Covenant was another one of our code names, this one for the ironclad co-ownership agreement we had drafted right before my first deployment. It was my one condition for allowing my mother and Richard to live in the cabin after I inherited it. Laura had structured it like a fortress. He doesn't have a chance in hell, Danny. Laura's voice was laced with cold confidence. I could hear the scroll of her mouse. Here it is, encrypted PDF. This agreement explicitly states that any transaction, sale, lease, transfer of any kind, requires the physical presence of both signing parties, you and me, before a registered notary public. Legally speaking, his sale agreement is toilet paper. He just walked himself onto a minefield. A wave of relief, so potent it almost made my knees weak, washed over me. I figured as much, but he's created a mess that needs to be contained. Consider it contained, she said. What's your next order? This was where my training kicked in, commander's intent. I didn't need to micromanage Laura. I just had to give her the mission objective. I need target intelligence, I commanded. The agent's name, the brokerage firm, the buyer's name. I want to know everything about them. Are they accomplices or just victims of his con? Already on it, Laura said, her typing speeding up. I can access public records and a few other legal databases. I'll have a preliminary dossier for you within 2 hours. You just focus on staying safe over there. I've got the home front. Her words were a shield. For the first time since Richard's call, I felt like I could breathe again. Then her voice softened, losing the military cadence and becoming the voice of the girl I grew up with. Hey, Danny. Yeah? You know that bottle of Macallan 18 we were saving for your homecoming? I pictured it instantly, sitting on the top shelf of her bar cart, gathering dust and anticipation. I remember. It's now our victory bottle, she said, and I could hear the fierce loyalty in her voice. I'm not opening it until we're sitting on that cabin porch again, together. I promise. Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them away. Copy that, Jensen. We hung up. My second call was to a far less secure line, a crackly video connection to a small town in the foothills of the Rockies. The grizzled, familiar face of Sergeant Peterson, USMC retired, filled the screen. He was wiping down the polished wood of his bar, a place that was an unofficial VFW hall for veterans in the area. Sarge had served with my dad. He was as close to a link to my father as I had left. He squinted at the screen. Meryl, you look like hell. Good to see you too, Sarge, I said, a small smile touching my lips for the first time that day. I kept it brief. Sarge, Richard is trying to sell the cabin. The friendly crinkles around his eyes vanished. His face hardened into the granite expression of a Marine drill instructor. The rag in his hand stopped moving. "That son of a bitch," he growled, his voice a low rumble. "Listen to me, kid. Your father didn't raise a soldier to retreat. You fight for that ground the way he taught you. You need a character witness, someone to testify to your father's wishes for that place. You call me, I'll be there in a heartbeat." His words were like a shot of adrenaline. He was my reserve force, my moral high ground. My father's legacy wasn't just in me. It lived in the men he served with. Men of honor who understood what that cabin represented. It wasn't just property, it was a memorial. "Thank you, Sarge. That means more than you know." "Hoorah!" he grunted, and the screen went black. Watching the pixels of Sarge's determined face fade, I knew my flanks were secure. With Laura as my legal artillery and Sarge as my character witness, I was no longer a lone soldier fighting a defensive action. I was a commander with a fire support base. Back in Denver, Laura was already moving. A few minutes later, an email notification popped up on my screen. It was from her. The subject line read, "Operation Ghost Pine. Phase 1 initiated." The first shots had been fired. The flight back to the States was a blur of engine noise and anticipation. My request for emergency leave had been approved with surprising speed, and within 48 hours, I was touching down at Peterson Air Force Base. I didn't even stop to change. I drove my stored Jeep straight from the base to my small rental apartment in Colorado Springs, still wearing my desert camouflage uniform. The grit of Afghanistan was still on my boots and under my fingernails. I wanted him to see it. He was already there, as I knew he would be. Richard was leaning against his leased black BMW, a picture of smug impatience. He'd clearly been waiting, planning an ambush on my home turf. He didn't wait for an invitation, just pushed off the car and followed me up the walkway as I unlocked my door. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carrying the tone of a man used to being in charge. I didn't answer him. I stepped inside and he followed, closing the door behind him with a decisive click. I walked to the center of my small living room and calmly set my duffel bag on the floor. Then I turned to face him. I planted my feet shoulder-width apart, straightened my spine, and crossed my arms over my chest. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, my gaze level and unwavering. It was a lesson I'd learned at West Point. Command presence. You can control a room without ever raising your voice. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is a calculated silence. He was visibly thrown off balance. He had expected tears, or yelling, or pleading. He had expected the emotional 18-year-old from Thanksgiving dinner. He was not prepared for the soldier standing before him. He recovered quickly, reverting to his default setting, manipulation. He launched into his well-rehearsed performance, his voice dripping with false sincerity. He talked about his debts, the bad real estate market, the weight of carrying the family on his shoulders. He was trying to paint himself as the hero, the man making tough choices for the good of the family. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to hold everything together here?" he said, his voice rising with theatrical frustration. "While you're off playing soldier?" I let him talk. I let him spin his entire web of lies and half-truths. I listened as he tried to pile guilt on my shoulders, brick by heavy brick. When he finally ran out of steam, the silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Then I spoke. My voice was low, devoid of any emotion except a chilling clarity. "I don't play games, Richard," I said. "I serve. And while I was serving, you attempted to commit grand larceny. Do not confuse the two." The word larceny hung in the air like a foul smell. His face flushed a deep, angry red. "That's a ridiculous accusation. It was a business deal. I have a signed contract." "You talk about contracts," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the small desk in the corner. I opened my laptop. "Let's talk about contracts." I swiveled the screen to face him. "This is an email from my lawyer, sent to me this morning. Attached, you'll find a PDF copy of the co-ownership agreement, the Steel Covenant, that you seem to have forgotten about. It outlines, in no uncertain terms, the legal requirements for any sale." His eyes darted across the screen, his bravado beginning to crack. "And this," I continued, clicking on an audio file, "is a recorded conversation Laura had with your real estate agent yesterday." I hit play. Laura's clear professional voice filled the room. So you're confirming Mr. Stone told you he was the sole owner with full authority to sell? The agent's flustered voice replied. Yes, that's what he said. If I'd known another party was involved, a service member on active duty no less, I never would have. I clicked the audio off. The color drained from Richard's face, leaving a pasty white pallor. He looked like a man who had just watched his escape route get blown up right in front of him. He was cornered, and like any cornered animal, he chose his last, most pathetic weapon: emotional blackmail. He tried to soften his expression, taking a step toward me. Danny, please, he said, his voice now a desperate whine. You'll break your mother's heart. He reached out as if to touch my arm in a gesture of reconciliation. It wasn't about comfort. It was a physical attempt to reclaim control, to invade my space and diminish my resolve. I took one precise step back. It was a small movement, but it was a declaration. This ground is mine. You are not welcome here. I moved closer to him then, my own presence now overwhelming his. I lowered my voice, infusing it with all the controlled authority I possessed. My mother's heart was broken a long time ago, Richard, and you were the one holding the hammer. I let that sink in for a beat. So now you have two options. Option 1, you pick up your phone, you call the buyer, and you cancel this entire fraudulent deal yourself. You will tell them it was a mistake. You will make it go away. Option 2, my lawyer calls the district attorney's office at or 900 tomorrow morning and files a criminal complaint for fraud and forgery. You have, I glanced at my watch, 12 hours to make your choice. I walked to the front door and opened it, letting the bright Colorado sunlight flood the room. This meeting is over, I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. Get out of my house. He stared at me for a long moment, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. For the first time in his life, Richard Stone had been given a direct order by me. And for the first time in his life, he obeyed it. Without another word, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed in the small apartment. I had won the battle, but I knew, with every fiber of my being, the war was far from over. He wouldn't just give up, he would escalate. The 12-hour deadline I gave Richard came and went. 9 a.m. the next morning arrived with a deafening silence. No phone call, no text message, nothing. He was calling my bluff, betting on the assumption that I wouldn't dare escalate a family matter into a public legal firestorm. It was the classic narcissist's gamble. Push the boundaries, assuming your victim's desire for peace outweighs their desire for justice. He miscalculated. Badly. Laura had anticipated this. At precisely 9:01 a.m., she executed Phase 2 of our operation. A formal demand letter, drafted in cold, unforgiving legalese, was dispatched via courier and certified mail to Richard's real estate agent. It detailed the fraudulent misrepresentation of ownership and threatened a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the brokerage firm for negligence if the transaction was not immediately frozen and all marketing materials removed. Simultaneously, a copy of that letter was emailed to the buyer's mortgage lender. It wasn't just a shot across the bow, it was a surgical strike on Richard's entire support system. We were cutting him off at the knees. Cornered and panicking, his camp did what desperate people do. They stopped fighting with logic and started fighting dirty. They opened a new front, not in a courtroom, but on social media. My stepsister, Chloe, launched the first volley. She posted a long, rambling diatribe on her Facebook page, a masterpiece of passive aggression and manipulative sentimentality. It was accompanied by a carefully selected photo of her, Richard, and my mother, all smiling radiantly during a past Christmas. The photo was a lie, a snapshot of a happiness that never existed beyond the camera lens. Her post was a work of art. She wrote about her hard-working stepfather who was just trying to keep the family afloat. She painted a picture of me as the cold, successful, but heartless stepsister, an army officer who cared more about an old, dusty cabin than her own family's well-being. She decried how I was trying to destroy them, to ruin her father's reputation over a simple misunderstanding. It was a public execution of my character. Within hours, the post had hundreds of reactions and shares. The comments section was a cesspool of outrage from people who had no idea of the real story. I was called a thankless child, materialistic, a disgrace to the uniform. The digital mob had been summoned, and they were baying for my blood. The final gut-wrenching twist of the knife was a single comment from my own mother, Carol. She wrote simply, "I just wish my daughters could find a way to get along." It was a cowardly neutral statement that, in its refusal to defend me, was the most damning indictment of all. It positioned me as an equal aggressor, turning a clear case of right and wrong into a petty sibling squabble. For a moment, sitting in my quiet apartment, scrolling through the venom, I felt that old, familiar sting of shame and isolation. This was their true power, to reframe reality, to make me the villain in my own story. But the sting didn't last. It was quickly replaced by a cold, hard anger. They had made a critical error. They had brought their fight into the light, and in doing so, they had given me a new weapon. That night, I found myself pulling out the old, worn Bible my father had carried with him on his last deployment. His pencil markings were faded in the margins. My fingers traced a verse he had underlined in Ephesians 6:11. "Put on the full armor of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes." This was more than a legal battle. It was a spiritual one, a fight for truth against deceit. I closed the book, my resolve cemented. The next morning, Laura and I launched our counterattack. We didn't engage on Facebook. We didn't sink to their level. We operated with precision. Laura took a screenshot of Chloe's entire post, including my mother's comment and the flood of vitriol, and attached it to a new email. She sent it directly to the prospective buyers of the cabin. Her message was short and powerful. "I believe this will be of interest to you," she wrote. "This is the character of the people with whom you are entering into a contract. Not only are they engaging in legal fraud, but they are also willing to publicly slander a decorated, active-duty Army officer to cover their tracks. I trust you and your legal counsel will act accordingly." The effect was instantaneous. The buyers, who Laura's initial contact had revealed were already getting nervous, were now utterly horrified. The deal wasn't just legally risky anymore, it was morally toxic. They called their lawyer, who then called Richard's agent with a vengeance. The agent, facing a lawsuit from us and the loss of a commission, immediately folded. The whole house of cards Richard had built began to collapse. The fallout was swift. The real estate agent's brokerage launched an internal investigation. The buyer's lawyer filed a formal notice of withdrawal. With all this new evidence, the agent's testimony, the buyer's withdrawal, the public character assassination, Laura no longer had just a civil case. She had a criminal one. She compiled everything into a neat, undeniable package and walked it over to the Denver Police Department's Economic Crimes Unit. 2 days later, my phone rang. The caller ID was a blocked number. "Captain Merrill?" a man's voice asked. It was calm, professional, with the weary authority of a career cop. "This is she," I answered. "My name is Detective Miller. I'm with the Denver PD Economic Crimes Unit. We've received the file from your attorney, Ms. Jensen." I held my breath. "Captain," he said, and I could hear him shuffling papers. "I've reviewed the documents, the ownership agreement, the testimony from the agent, and this Facebook post. I want you to know, what we're looking at here is not a family dispute. This is felony fraud. We are opening a formal criminal investigation into Richard Stone. I need you to trust us to handle this." Hanging up the phone, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The fight was no longer just mine and Laura's. The wheels of justice, slow but powerful, had started to turn. I had truth, the law, and now the Denver PD on my side. I didn't know it then, but pushing Richard into that corner would trigger an explosion far bigger and uglier than I could have ever imagined. Backed into a corner by the cold machinery of the law, Richard did what all cornered manipulators do. He abandoned strategy, abandoned reason, and simply exploded. His weapon of choice was a bottle of bourbon and his car keys. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when the assault began. I was jolted from a light, restless sleep by a sound that shook my entire apartment building. A frantic, rhythmic pounding on my front door. It wasn't a knock, it was a physical attack on the wood. Boom! 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 Then, his voice, thick with whiskey and rage, ripped through the quiet night. You ruined everything, you ungrateful bitch! Who the hell do you think you are, coming after me? I didn't move from my bed. I didn't scream. My training kicked in, my heart rate steadying even as adrenaline flooded my system. I slipped out from under the covers, my feet silent on the cold floor. I stayed away from the door, moving to the side of the window where I could see without being seen. Across the courtyard, lights began to flick on in my neighbors' apartments. Silhouettes appeared in windows. Richard was putting on a show for the whole complex. He wasn't just a con man anymore, he was unhinged. This was a physical invasion of my sanctuary, a deliberate act of intimidation. I felt no fear, only a profound, chilling disgust. I remembered a concept from my military training, the rules of engagement, the ROE. They define the circumstances under which you are permitted to use force. You don't fire on a potential threat, you wait until the threat becomes imminent and hostile. Richard had just crossed that line. He had escalated from a legal problem to a direct threat to my safety. The pounding continued, punctuated by a stream of slurred, vicious insults. But I wasn't the only one listening. My next-door neighbor, a retired firefighter named Dave, was a man who knew the sound of a crisis. I saw his porch light flick on, and then I heard his deep, calm voice on the phone through my wall. Yes, 911. I've got a drunk and disorderly individual attempting to break down my neighbor's door. Within minutes, the silent, pulsing strobes of red and blue police lights washed over my living room walls. The cavalry had arrived. I moved to the peephole then, watching the scene unfold. 2 officers from the Colorado Springs Police Department were on my doorstep, their stances wide and authoritative. Richard was still yelling, pointing a trembling finger at my door, his face puce in the flashing lights. She's in there, the little witch who thinks her uniform makes her better than everyone. The officers were calm, professional. They tried to de-escalate, but Richard was too far gone. When he shoved one of the officers, it was over. In a swift, practiced motion, they had him turned around, his hands cuffed behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed across the silent courtyard. They were reading him his Miranda rights as they guided his sputtering, intoxicated form into the back of a squad car. Only then did I open my door. I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed, and watched them drive him away. In that moment, watching the taillights disappear down the street, every last shred of doubt I might have had evaporated. Every question about whether I was being too harsh, every flicker of misplaced family loyalty, was gone. Richard wasn't just a failed real estate broker with a gambling problem. He was a menace, a reckless, uncontrollable force of chaos. He had crossed the final red line. The next morning, as expected, my mother called. Her voice was a frantic, panicked squeak. Richard's been arrested. Danny, you have to do something. Call them, drop the charges. You can't let him go to jail. I listened patiently, not interrupting her torrent of panicked pleas. She spoke of his reputation, of their finances, of how this would ruin them. Not once did she ask if I was okay. Not once did she acknowledge the terror of having a drunk man trying to beat down my door at 2 a.m. When she finally paused to take a breath, I spoke, my voice as calm and toneless as a frozen lake. Mom, I said, I didn't do this. He did. He made his choices, and now he is facing the consequences. And I am making mine. I hung up the phone before she could reply, cutting off the connection before her toxic brand of peace could poison my resolve. An hour later, my phone rang again. It was Detective Miller. Captain Merrill, he said, his voice all business. We held Mr. Stone overnight. He's facing charges for public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and assaulting an officer. Combined with his behavior last night and the evidence you've already provided, we have a very strong case for felony fraud and harassment. The question now, Captain, is do you want to press forward with the charges? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the new day. The sun was just beginning to crest over the sharp peaks of the Rocky Mountains, flooding the sky with brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was a new dawn. If you believe that there are some lines that, once crossed, can never be uncrossed, hit that like button. And if you've ever had to make a hard choice to protect your own peace, just type, "I chose me," in the comments below. Let's stand together. I turned back from the window, my decision absolute. "Yes, detective," I said, my voice steady and clear as the morning sun. "Proceed. He needs to be held accountable for his actions." With those words, I drew the final line in the sand. There was no going back. The rules of engagement had changed. The threat was no longer just financial, it was physical, and I would meet it with the full force of the law. The day before the mandatory mediation session with the district attorney's office, a storm rolled down from the mountains, washing the city in a clean, cold rain. As I stood watching the water streak down my apartment window, my phone buzzed. It was Sarge. "Got something for you," he said, his voice raspy as ever. "Be there in an hour." True to his word, an hour later, his old Ford pickup truck, a vehicle as weathered and reliable as the man himself, pulled into the parking lot. He walked up to my door carrying a small, olive-drab metal box. It was an old military footlocker, the kind used for personal effects, with rust blooming at the corners and a small dent in the lid. He held it out to me with both hands, like an offering. "Your father gave this to me just before his last deployment," Sarge said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. He looked past me, into the distance of his memory. He said, "Sarge, if anything happens to me, you make sure Danny gets this. But not right away. Give it to her when she really, truly needs it. I think," he said, his gaze meeting mine again, clear and steady. "Now's that time." He placed the box in my hands. It was heavier than it looked, weighted with more than just its physical contents. It was weighted with history, with a promise kept for over a decade. I thanked him, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name, and brought it inside. I set the box on my small kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before finally working the stiff metal latches. They popped open with a loud click, releasing the faint, familiar scent of old paper, gun oil, and my father. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay his legacy. There were a few faded photographs, one of him holding me as a toddler on the unfinished porch of the cabin, both of us grinning, another of him in his dress uniform, looking impossibly young and proud. There was his sergeant's insignia, a bronze compass, and a small stack of letters he had written to me from overseas. And tucked beneath them all was a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. My name was written on the front in my father's strong, familiar handwriting. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The letter wasn't long, but every word was a testament to his love, a voice reaching out to me from across the Great Divide. He wrote about the cabin, not as a piece of property, but as a sanctuary. "This place isn't about wood and stone, Danny girl," he wrote. "It's a stronghold of peace. It's where you can always go to find your bearings when the world gets too loud. I want you to always have that." He told me to live a life of courage, to stand for something, and to never ever let anyone make me feel small or devalue my worth. He said he was proud of the woman I was becoming, a woman of honor and strength. Reading those words, a single silent tear traced a path through the dust on my cheek. It was the validation I had spent my entire adult life searching for, given to me by the one man whose opinion truly mattered. But it was the last paragraph that changed everything. It was the secret weapon he had left behind. "I've set up a small trust to handle the maintenance and taxes on the place, so it will never be a burden to you," he wrote. "And to make sure no one can ever take it from you, I had our family lawyer draw up a specific provision in my will. It states that your mother, Carol, has the right to live there for the rest of her life, a life estate, but she never has the right to sell, transfer, or use the property as collateral. Final ownership, absolute and undivided, belongs to you. The documents are with the lawyer's office." I read the paragraph again, and then a third time. My breath hitched in my chest. This wasn't just a wish. It was a legally binding directive. A firewall he had built around my inheritance, around his legacy, years before he died. He had foreseen a threat, and like the good soldier he was, he had prepared a defense. Richard and my mother hadn't just acted immorally, they had deliberately concealed a legal document. They had committed provable, undeniable fraud. This letter was the smoking gun. A profound sense of peace washed over me, extinguishing the last embers of my anger. This fight was no longer about revenge against Richard or my disappointment in my mother. It was bigger than that. It was about honoring my father's last will and testament. It was about defending the stronghold of peace he had left for me. I wasn't fighting against my family anymore. I was fighting for my father. I immediately called Laura and read the last paragraph to her over the phone. There was a moment of stunned silence on her end. Then, I heard her let out a low whistle. "Danny," she said, her voice filled with a lawyer's awe. "That's not a smoking gun. That's a nuclear bomb. Get me a high-resolution scan of that letter now. We need to have a handwriting expert verify it, and we need to subpoena the original will from that law firm." I followed her instructions, my hands steady now, my purpose clear. An hour later, she called back. "It's over, Danny," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Game, set, match. Richard Stone is finished." I looked at the letter lying on my table. Laura was right, the game was over. But it didn't feel like a game anymore. I folded the precious piece of paper carefully, its crisp edges a comfort in my hands. I placed it in the inside pocket of my blazer, the one I would wear to the mediation tomorrow, right over my heart. Walking into that room tomorrow, I wouldn't be walking in alone. My father would be right there with me. The conference room at the district attorney's office was cold and impersonal, designed to strip away emotion and leave only facts. The long mahogany table gleamed under sterile fluorescent lights. On one side sat Richard, my mother Carol, and their flustered, overpriced lawyer. Richard was attempting to project an air of wounded dignity, the victim of a terrible family misunderstanding. My mother was a shrunken figure beside him, her eyes fixed on her tightly clasped hands in her lap. On the other side sat Laura and me, and at the head of the table, commanding the room, was the assistant district attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Davies. I remained completely silent, my back straight, my hands resting calmly on the table in front of me. I felt the worn edges of my father's letter through the thin fabric of my blazer pocket. I wasn't a participant in this drama anymore. I was an observer, waiting for the truth to do its work. Richard's lawyer began, his voice smooth and placating. "Ms. Davies, we're hoping to resolve this unfortunate family matter quickly. There's been a great deal of miscommunication, heightened emotions." Laura let him speak for precisely 30 seconds before she stood up, holding a slim folder. She didn't look at Richard or his lawyer. She addressed Ms. Davies directly. "With all due respect," Laura began, her voice crisp and clear, "this is not a misunderstanding. This is a sequence of deliberate, fraudulent acts. Allow me to present the timeline." She didn't speak with emotion. She presented the facts like a military briefer outlining a chain of command. 1, she stated. On October 12th, Mr. Stone contacted my client, Captain Merrill, who was on active duty in Afghanistan, to inform her of an illegal real estate transaction he had initiated without her consent. Richard shifted in his seat, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. 2, Laura continued, undeterred. Mr. Stone knowingly misrepresented himself as the sole property owner to the real estate agency, a fact the agent has already confirmed in a sworn affidavit. Richard's lawyer started to object, but Laura held up a hand. 3. Mr. Stone and his wife, Ms. Carol Stone, attempted to coerce Captain Merrill into signing fraudulent documents after the fact. 4. When Captain Merrill refused, Mr. Stone's daughter launched a public smear campaign on social media with Ms. Stone's implicit approval to defame the character of a serving officer. And 5. Following the initiation of a police investigation, Mr. Stone appeared at my client's residence at 2 a.m., intoxicated, and created a public disturbance that resulted in his arrest. She paused, letting the weight of the facts settle in the silent room. Richard's lawyer, flustered, finally spoke up. "This is all circumstantial. It's a he said, she said situation. A daughter lashing out at her stepfather. My mother, for the first time, looked up. Her eyes pleaded with Ms. Davies. He was just under pressure, she whispered. He didn't mean any harm. Laura smiled, a thin, dangerous smile that I knew well. I understand your skepticism, she said to Ms. Davies. Perhaps we should hear from someone else. She opened her folder and slid a single, plastic-sleeved document across the polished table. It was the high-resolution scan of my father's letter. This is the last personal letter written by Sergeant Frank Merrill before he was killed in action, Laura said, her voice softening with reverence. It contains his last will and testament regarding the property in question. Ms. Davies picked up the document. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. She began to read the letter aloud, her voice clear and steady. She read my father's words about the cabin being a stronghold of peace, about his pride in me. I saw my mother flinch. And then Ms. Davies reached the final paragraph. And to make sure no one can ever take it from you, I had our family lawyer draw up a specific provision in my will. It states that your mother, Carol, has the right to live there, but she never has the right to sell, transfer, or use the property as collateral. Final ownership, absolute and undivided, belongs to you. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. The words hung there, an undeniable, indestructible truth. Richard finally broke. That letter, it's fake. It has to be fake. She wrote it herself, he stammered, his face a blotchy canvas of panic. Laura was ready for him. We've already had the handwriting verified by a certified forensic expert who is prepared to testify, she said calmly. Furthermore, the man who held this letter in safekeeping for over a decade, retired Marine Sergeant Peterson, is also prepared to testify under oath as to its authenticity. And we have, of course, subpoenaed the original will from the law firm, which I'm told confirms this provision exactly. Every escape route was cut off. Every lie had been exposed. And then, my mother shattered. It wasn't a cry of regret. It was a raw, wounded wail of someone who had just been caught. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with horrible, gut-wrenching sobs. The sound was ugly, the sound of a person whose entire world of carefully constructed denial had just been demolished. She hadn't just been lied to. She had been a willing participant in the lie, and now she had to face it. Ms. Davies placed the letter gently back on the table. She turned her cold, analytical gaze on Richard. Mr. Stone, she said, her voice devoid of any sympathy. Your options have become extremely limited. You can accept a plea agreement right now for felony fraud, which will include full restitution of all legal fees, a permanent restraining order, and significant probation. Or we can proceed to a criminal trial where, I assure you, you will lose, and you will almost certainly serve jail time. Silence descended on the room, thick and suffocating. It was the sound of lies dying. Richard sat frozen, a statue of a defeated man. My mother just wept, her small choked sobs the only sound in the sterile conference room. The battle was over. And in the quiet aftermath, all that was left was the wreckage. Richard took the plea deal. Faced with the certainty of a trial he couldn't win, he folded. He was convicted of felony fraud, handed a suspended sentence, and slapped with 3 years of probation. The court ordered him to pay my full legal fees, forcing him to sell his precious BMW to cover the cost. The fraudulent sale of the cabin was officially nullified. On paper, it was a total victory, an unconditional surrender. But as I walked out of the courthouse with Laura, I didn't feel the elation I'd expected. There was no triumphant surge of adrenaline, no sweet taste of revenge. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness. The war was over, the enemy was vanquished, but I just felt tired, exhausted to my very soul. Winning, I was beginning to realize, felt a lot like surviving. A week later, my mother called. I almost didn't answer, but some lingering sense of duty made me swipe the screen. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask how I was. She launched straight into a litany of their hardships, the money they owed, the shame Richard felt, how difficult their lives had become. It was the same tired narrative of victimhood, the same refusal to accept accountability. I listened, for one last time, to the sound of her weakness. When she was finished, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice, I just stated my own truth. "Are you happy now, Danny?" she asked, her voice laced with a bitter, manipulative edge. "Is this what you wanted?" I took a deep breath, the words coming from a place of profound sadness, not anger. "I'm not happy, Mom," I said softly. "I'm just at peace. And I hope, one day, you find that for yourself." "Mom," I continued, my voice gentle but firm, "I love you. I will always love you. But I can't have both you and him in my life. It's not possible. I am choosing my peace now. When you're ready, truly ready to have a relationship that is just about you and me, you know my number. Until then, I need space." I ended the call before she could respond, before she could try to pull me back into the vortex of their chaos. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, an amputation of the heart. But I knew it was necessary for my own survival. That weekend, I drove up into the mountains. As I rounded the last bend in the gravel road, the cabin came into view, standing silent and steadfast among the tall pines, just as my father had left it. It looked smaller than I remembered, but just as solid. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the musty smell of disuse and neglect. A thin layer of dust covered everything, and a few of my mother's decorating magazines were scattered on the coffee table, ghosts of a life that was no longer welcome here. I didn't feel anger looking at her things. I just felt a quiet finality. I spent the entire day reclaiming the space. I threw open every window, letting the crisp, clean mountain air rush in, chasing out the old, stagnant energy. I pulled the dust covers off the furniture and beat them outside until clouds of dust motes danced in the sunlight. I found a stack of cardboard boxes in the shed and began to pack. I didn't throw her things away. I carefully wrapped her ceramic knickknacks in newspaper, folded her throw blankets, and stacked her magazines neatly. I packed it all away with a strange sense of detachment, like an archivist handling the artifacts of a forgotten civilization. It was an act not of anger, but of order. An act of respect for the woman she was, but a clear demarcation from the life she had chosen. I sealed the boxes with packing tape and moved them to the small storage shed out back. The cabin was my space now. The boundary was clear. Late in the afternoon, I sat on the porch, exhausted and sore, and pulled out my worn copy of Meditations. I flipped through the familiar pages until I found a passage my uncle had marked for me years ago. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." I realized that for years, my thoughts had been consumed by bitterness, by the injustice of it all. I had given Richard and my mother so much space in my head, rent-free. No more. I closed the book, deciding then and there not to let their poison taint my peace. My final act of the day was the most important. I had called a local locksmith from town, and as the sun began to dip low in the sky, his truck rumbled up the drive. He was a quiet, efficient man who worked quickly, removing the old lock sets and replacing them with new, heavy-duty hardware. He handed me a set of 2 freshly cut keys. "You're all set, ma'am," he said with a nod. After he left, I stood on the porch, the cool evening air raising goosebumps on my arms. The keys felt cold and solid in my palm. I looked out at the spectacular alpine glow, the last rays of sunlight setting the peaks of the Rockies on fire with shades of pink and orange. Holding the new cold keys in my hand, I watched the last sliver of sun disappear. The metallic click they made against each other in the quiet evening was the sound of a new beginning. A sound of security. For the first time in a very long time, the stronghold was truly safe. A few months later, the scent of summer grilling, hickory smoke, and sizzling burgers drifted from the porch of the cabin. Laughter echoed through the tall pine trees. This was a different kind of gathering, a different kind of family. There were no blood relatives here. My guests were my chosen family. Laura was there, her sharp lawyer's wit softened by a cold bottle of Colorado craft beer. Sarge Peterson held court by the grill, telling old war stories to a small group of veterans I had come to know through his bar. These were the people who had formed my defensive line, my support echelon. This was my tribe. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Laura brought out a bottle and 2 glasses. It was the Macallan 18, its dark amber liquid glowing in the twilight. She poured 2 generous measures and handed one to me. She raised her glass. "To Captain Merrill," she said, her voice clear and full of warmth, her toast carrying over the quiet chatter. "Who taught us all what it means to defend your stronghold?" The others raised their bottles and glasses. "Hoorah!" Sarge bellowed, and the toast was met with a chorus of cheers. We drank, and the smooth, peated scotch was the taste of a promise kept, of a victory earned not with bitterness, but with unwavering loyalty. It was the taste of coming home. I didn't return to active duty. My experiences had changed me, reshaped my definition of service. I transferred to the Army Reserve and took on a new mission. I became a consultant for a nonprofit organization that provides legal and administrative support to military families. My war had taught me how to navigate the complex bureaucracy that so often ensnares soldiers and their loved ones. I could turn my painful education into a shield for others. One afternoon, a young specialist, barely 20 years old, sat across from me in my small office. His shoulders were slumped, his face etched with worry. He told me about his ex-wife trying to claim his combat pay and benefits, leaving him with nothing. He looked lost, overwhelmed by a system designed to confuse and exhaust. I looked at him, and I didn't just see a client. I saw a younger version of myself, isolated and under attack. I gave him a calm, reassuring smile. "Don't worry, specialist," I said, pulling a fresh legal pad toward me. "We're going to build a battle plan." For the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. I realized then that this was my new legacy. My father had left me a stronghold of peace made of wood and stone. I would build a legacy of strongholds for others, forged from knowledge and resilience. A few weeks after that, on a quiet Tuesday morning, my phone rang. I saw the name on the screen and my breath caught. It was my mother. I hesitated for a moment, then answered, my new boundaries holding firm. Her voice was different. The panicked, brittle edge was gone, replaced by something hesitant, almost fragile. "Danica," she said. I just wanted to tell you. I left Richard. I'm staying with a friend for now." I was silent for a moment, processing the information. There was no, "I'm sorry," no plea for forgiveness. There was just a simple statement of fact. It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was a start. I didn't offer to fix things. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I just acknowledged her reality and my own. "Thank you for letting me know, Mom," I said, my voice gentle. "Take care of yourself." It was a tiny seed of hope, planted not in the scorched earth of the past, but in a small, carefully tended garden, protected by a very strong fence. What would grow from it, I didn't know. But for the first time, I was content to just wait and see. The story ends here, on a cool, clear morning. I'm sitting alone on the porch of the cabin, a thick ceramic mug of hot black coffee warming my hands. The early morning mist clings to the pine needles, and the air is so clean it almost hurts to breathe it in. The world is quiet, save for the chatter of a nearby squirrel and the whisper of the wind through the trees. I'm not thinking about Richard, or my mother, or the battles of the past. I'm not planning for the future. I am simply here. Present. I have fought in the farthest corners of the world, endured the heat and the dust and the constant threat of violence. But the peace I feel now, in this place, in this quiet moment, this is the greatest victory of my life. It's a peace I didn't just find, but a peace I fought for, planned for, and built with my own 2 hands. I had finally found my home, not in the wood and stone of the cabin, but in the quiet strength of my own soul. Captain Danica Merrill was, at long last, home. And so, my story comes to a close, right here on this porch. The battle for my father's legacy is over, but I know the most important fight is the one we wage for our own peace. My stronghold is this cabin, but it's also the resilience I found within myself. We all have a stronghold worth defending. If you feel comfortable, I would be honored if you shared in the comments what your personal stronghold is, be it a place, a person, or a principle you live by. Please press the like button if you believe in the power of setting boundaries. And to become part of a community that shares stories of strength and survival, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening and for being a part of my healing. Remember to always, always defend your ground.